the bonds that had held the empire together fraying to the breaking point. During the middle phase, all of these factors would combine to explode Rome into an anarchic mess. Lasting from 253 to 268, this middle phase will be defined by the reigns of Valerian and his son Gallienus. Now, in the context of the times, the 15-year combined reign of Valerian and his son seems to indicate a level of stability, but in fact, it masks instability on a scale that would only be matched during the final decades of the 400s AD as the West fell apart completely. Those of you who have read ahead know that not only did imperial usurpers rise and fall faster during this middle phase of the crisis than at any other period in Roman history, but also that beginning in the 260s, the empire would actually spend about 15 years divided into thirds, after new kingdoms in the northwest and east successfully broke away from Rome. The final phase of the crisis, which lasted roughly from the death of Gallienus in 268 until the elevation of Diocletian in 284, was the recovery period, during which a series of vigorous emperors from Illyria battled back through the chaos to re-establish the supremacy of Rome, both internally and externally. Next time, we'll open the middle phase of the crisis with the elevation of Valerian and his son Gallienus. Though Valerian was at the time one of the most respected men in the empire, his destiny was unfortunately to go down in history as an imperial embarrassment. To his credit, he immediately opened up a war in the east to punish the Sassanids for their sack of Syria. But when he was captured alive by Shapur in 260, his name became synonymous with the general felling of once mighty Rome. There will be no episode next week as I am headed down to the Austin City Limits Music Festival, but we'll be back in 2 weeks to see just how bad we can make things for the Romans. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend another classic non-Roman history book, The March of Folly by Barbara Tuchman, the classic study of how the responsible agents of state often pursue policies that run absolutely counter to their own interests. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 112, Captured Alive. In the autumn of 253 AD, the troops supporting short-lived Emperor Aemilius Aemilianus abandoned the man they had so recently elevated to the purple, and defected en masse to Valerian. I think we can forgive the Romans for at first not investing too much emotional energy in this newly appointed emperor, because, after all, in the 18 years since the assassination of Alexander Severus, the empire had seen 11 different men claim the title Augustus. There was absolutely no reason to believe that the new emperor would not simply come and go along with all the rest. But when Valerian descended from the Alps, he wound up bringing with him 15 years of relative stability at the top of the political pyramid, at least in a sense. Sure, the western provinces of Gaul, Britannia, Hispania, Germania Superior, Germania Inferior, and Raetia would break away in 260, losses that would be matched in that year when Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and most of Asia Minor came under the control of the city of Palmyra. But the middle of the empire, Greece and the Balkans and Italy, would, from 253 to 268, be the domains of Valerian and his son, Publius Licinius Ignatius Gallienus, and their reign will form the bridge between the old empire of Augustus and Hadrian Marcus Aurelius and the coming empire of Diocletian and Constantine and Theodosius. Now, whether the fractured stability of Gallienus was more dangerous than the unified political anarchy that preceded him is a question scholars still debate today. As soon as Valerian's claim to power was recognized by the Senate in October 253, he wasted no time inducing them to further elevate his son Gallienus to the rank of co-Augustus. Having two emperors was a critical part of Valerian's plan for the empire, and indeed, the rapidity with which he began to pursue that plan have left some questioning whether or not the new emperor had dragged his feet a little getting out of Germany. That maybe, after receiving the distress call from Gallus, that Valerian decided to simply let Gallus and Aemilianus fight it out, which would allow him to sweep down and brush aside whoever was left standing after the showdown. But whether he was actively planning for what he would do when he became emperor, or whether he just had an idea of what he would do if rating Valerian's elevation to the throne and the announcement that he was heading to Syria to reassert Roman power in the east. The main point of rising up Gallienus was so that Valerian could be sure that the Western Empire was left in loyal hands while he focused on the Eastern Front. This division of the empire followed the previous division of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus a century before, though this time it was the senior Augusti who went east, with his junior partner remaining in Rome. One of the big problems we have in dealing with the crisis of the 3rd century is that establishing a definitive chronology through the chaos is almost impossible. What sources we have are contradictory and full of biases and outright fabrications. For example, even when we deal with a momentous event like Aurelian's evacuation of Dacia, all we can say is that it happened sometime between 271 and 274. Everything else is just guesswork. We can make good guesses, but they are nonetheless still guesses. Just how crossed up the history of the mid-3rd century can get begins to really become apparent during the joint reign of Valerian and Gallienus. For the next little while, dates are going to fall in ranges, and a lot of question marks are going to surround where people were and when they were there. We know basically what happened, and basically what order it happened in, but sometimes, well, we really don't. That all being said, probably by early 254, Valerian was headed to Syria to survey the damage wrought by the recent Sassanid invasion. Gallienus, meanwhile, headed up north to the Rhine on a mission to repel Germanic incursions that had begun the minute Valerian picked up the legions guarding the border and marched them to Italy. The pattern of these northern invasions would become a familiar one over the next 20-odd years and highlight the cyclical nature of the 3rd century crisis. Anytime border troops were called elsewhere to deal with some emergency, barbarians beyond the frontier would invade the under-garrisoned territory left behind, forcing troops from elsewhere to be called in and plug the gap, leading to invasions in whatever territory those troops had just left behind, and so on and so on. Then, whatever territory was left holding the bag would have to look to their local commander to engineer a defense, and if he succeeded despite imperial aid, his troops would generally hail him as emperor, precipitating a civil war, forcing the existing emperor to come put down the uprising, and then the cycle would start all over again. Valerian's withdrawal of the Rhine legions to help him win power in Italy precipitated the beginning of one of these long cycles. Germanic tribes took the opportunity to pour across the border and raid the wealth of Gaul. The junior emperor's arrival in country seems to have brought an end to the pillaging, and between 253 and 255, Gallienus seems to have won a number of, if they can't quite be called battles, then at least significant skirmishes that forced the various tribes to withdraw back across the Rhine. Valerian, meanwhile, passed through the Balkans and marched across Asia Minor on his way to Syria. While he was on the move, the Goths and other associated tribes beyond the Danube appear to have prudently waited for the imperial army to pass before they renewed their forays into Roman territory. As soon as Valerian was gone, though, various independent Gothic groups once again began descending south in search of the great wealth of the Roman Empire. Valerian, though, had much bigger things on his plate than the Goths, who, though they had done damage to the Empire's ego, were still small potatoes compared to the truly existential threat posed by the Sassanids. Where the Goths were dangerous rabble, the Sassanids were a well-organized rival civilization in the fullest sense of the word, and their attacks on the east threatened not just the rich provinces of Syria and Asia Minor, which accounted for a great deal of imperial tax revenue, but also the all-important province of Egypt and its critical grain supply. Valerian planted his court at Antioch, and for the next few years he rebuilt the Syrian capital and the infrastructure of the surrounding countryside. At some point, he retook the border city of Nispus, and by 257, things were mostly back to the way they had been before Shapur's great raid of 253. The Sassanid king could only sit back and watch the Romans regroup, as the presence of the emperor and his army were enough to make him think twice about simply repeating his invasion of a few years before. Of course, with Valerian in Syria and Gallienus in Gaul, the Danube frontier became the odd man out, and, as I just said, Gothic armies began to once again pour south across the river. Sometime around 255, this new invasion forced Gallienus to march in from the west and reinforce the Middle Empire. With the emperor on the scene, or should I say, with the resources the emperor brought with him on the scene, the Romans were able to once again plug the Northern League and push the Goths back across the river. But as Gallienus campaigned in the Middle Empire, the West inevitably slid back into chaos, forcing the junior emperor to head back to Gaul. Hoping to keep everyone in line after he was gone, Gallienus elevated his son, Valerian II, to the rank of Caesar, and left the young man as the figurehead of record for all the Danube provinces. Actual administration of the provinces, though, was, critically, left in the hands of a general by the name of Ingenuus, who we will have cause to deal with in just a moment. The invasion Gallienus rushed back to deal with eventually became serious enough to draw all three members of the imperial tripartite to the Lower Rhine. Valerian took a gamble that he would be able to leave the east in the hands of subordinates without triggering an invasion by Shapur, and, with Syria mostly rebuilt, he headed to Gaul in 257 to personally oversee the situation. That gamble would not pay off. As soon as Valerian left, the Sassanids were once again on the move. Obviously, this raises the question that it brought Valerian all the way back from Syria to face. The answer lies in a super-confederation of Germanic tribes making their first, but certainly not last appearance in the history of Rome, the Franks. The Franks, who in time would become the reason why we call France, France, and not Gaul, were, as I just said, formed out of a collection of Germanic tribes who lived primarily along the Lower Rhine. Likely included among their number were the Batavians, who, you'll recall, revolted against Roman rule while the empire was occupied with the year of the